So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to the keynote speech this evening by Professor Jeremy Adelman on democracy and the stranger. The keynote is part of the second annual conference of the Albert Hirschman Institute. It's on democracy in and at the margins, from the margins. And the keynote takes up some of the themes of the conference, but also asks the question, does global integration undermine democracy? This is a theme I'll come to in a moment, but let me first introduce Jeremy, because we've been waiting for a long time to host him here, and it's a great pleasure and a privilege to welcome you to the Graduate Institute and especially to the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. He's the Henry Charles Lee Professor of History and Director of the Global History Lab at Princeton, and recipient of the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship. I'm going to leave out the other awards, but I am going to say something about his work for those of you who are not familiar with it. But for most importantly, in our context and the context of the center, he is the biographer of Albert Hirschman, also a friend of Albert's and Sarah's, someone who knew both of them very well, and has written, in my view, one of the most brilliant and the most memorable intellectual biographies I have ever read. So I can only recommend to everyone who has missed reading it so far his acclaimed biography titled Worldly Philosopher, The Odyssey of Albert O. Hirschman, which chronicles the lives, times, the passions of the 20th century's most original and provocative thinker. It explores his writings in the context of the larger debates in the social sciences in the last century as well. This is the first biography of Albert Hirschman, after whom our center is named, and it traces how his personal experiences shaped his unique intellectual perspective. It also delineates Albert Hirschman's enduring legacy as one of hope, of open-mindedness, of practical idealism. But I think what is also interesting in the context of the Institute is the fact that what the biography also narrates is why there is an Hirschmanian style of social inquiry. And why is it qualitative? Why does it privilege close observation and intimate knowledge of the field? And why is it marked by not only an aversion to abstract theorizing, but also to any pretense to grand claims of certainty of knowledge? Like Albert Hirschman, Jeremy Adelman too has lived and worked in 4 continents, among them South America, which was formative for Albert Hirschman's work on development. Jeremy is a historian of South America who is currently working on a monograph, Latin America, A Global History, that aims to tell the story of what we now call Latin America as an ongoing regional site for what he calls world-making and integration from 1492 to the present. And I think we're going to hear something about that book later. His first book, titled Frontier Development, Land, Labor, and Capital in the Wheatlands of Argentina and Canada, was a comparative study of the agrarian systems of these 2 countries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The next book, Republic of Capital, Buenos Aires and the Legal Transformation of the Atlantic World, explores the emergence of the Argentine Republic and its incorporation into the world market in the 19th century. It's an amazing study of the legal and political foundations of Argentinian capitalism and shows how merchants and capitalists coped with massive political upheavals, but also how intellectuals and political writers in those times sought to forge a model of liberal republicanism that aimed for open markets but closed the polity to broad participation. Thus, in a sense, one can really see, if one looks at the book today, he wrote it in 1999, but I think if you read the book again, what one realizes is that many of Argentina's recent problems, and those on other parts of the Latin American continent as well, can be traced back to the framework and the foundations of the kinds of states and statehood that were established in the 19th century on the continent. 2006, he published Sovereignty and Revolution, in the Iberian Atlantic, which weaves together intellectual, economic, and political histories to argue that modern nations of sovereignty in the Atlantic world have been unstable, contested, and equivocal from the very beginning. He explores in it how contemporary notions of sovereignty emerged in the Americas as a response to European imperial crises in the Age of Revolutions, and how many modern-day uncertainties about property, about citizenship, and human rights were forged in a contest over the very nature of state power in 18th and early 19th centuries across transatlantic entanglements. So the emergence of Latin American nations, and indeed many of our contemporary notions of sovereignty, he argues, contrary to mainstream wisdom, was the effect and not the cause of the breakdown of European empires. His forthcoming book studies how artists and writers, diplomats and ecologists have been wrestling with the meaning of global interdependence and attitudes to strangers from the 1850s to the present, a topic that leads us directly into tonight's lecture, Democracy and the Stranger, Does Global Integration Undermine Democracy? Globalization and democracy, which are presented often as a matter of either or choice, is something which the lecture today will question. And in his talk this evening, Professor Adelman reflects on the life and work of Albert Hirschman to consider how voices from the margins could inform both democratic practices and capitalist life. A warm welcome to you, and thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much. With introductions like that, I feel there's nothing else to do but to fall off the stage or something like that. I just want to make sure that this, how do we switch from this to the, there we go. Okay. Now I want to slideshow from the beginning. There we go. Okay, perfect. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming out. I realize this is the capstone of what's been a very long and intense day, and I'm also the figure that stands between a long and intense day and a glass of wine, biodynamic wine. So I'm going to move through a lot of territory and a lot of images as quickly as I can. And sprinkle Albert Hirschman around the presentation. I'm also going to do a little role reversal. I was quite struck today, participating in conversations with social scientists who had these lovely, wonderful, granular studies of democracy and not democracy in action on the ground. And that's usually the domain of the historian, into the detail, into the narrative, without any big theory. And I realize I'm going to do some flip-flopping here and play and masquerade a bit and do some concept exploring with you. But let's start with where we are now. See if this thing works. Yes, okay. This is very recent on the border of Guatemala and Mexico. It's actually a very problematic photograph. As you can imagine, could get used in a variety of ways. It's a picture of Hondurans swarming across a border post at Ciudad Hidalgo, fleeing narco-violence and an inept puppet state in Honduras, beginning a march that's been getting a lot of play in the United States towards the Mexican-American border, and at least until the recent bombings and the killings in Pittsburgh, which I will not mention, had been dominating the news feed and being picked up particularly by right-wing media, Fox News especially, in why we should build walls, why Americans shouldn't build a wall and seal off the border. Just to take you nearby, it's actually a scene slightly north of here. This is 35 years ago. This is also near the border of Guatemala and Mexico. These were refugees that I was working with, of Guatemalans who had forded the river to flee to the state of Chiapas, fleeing from the then dictator, General Rios Montt. Some things have not really changed. There has been a flow of migrants and refugees for many decades. And yet we live in a strange planet. An image I want to come back to at the very end, of juxtapositions of mass mobilization and of strong men, of planetary consciousness, heightened planetary consciousness, and nation fisters, nation firsters waving their fists. In a sense, it's a great unhinging. And I would draw your attention to the contrast because I think this is one of the reasons why we have to be skeptical of the kind of big concepts I'm going to throw out this evening, that it's very hard to predict what's going to happen on this strange planet. But 3 decades ago, some people had very strong predictions of what was going to happen. Very different image of Francis Fukuyama. It does not look, 30 years later, as if history has ended. For those of you who don't know, he wrote a very celebrated essay in 1989, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, predicting what he had titled, actually with a question mark that got erased from the discussion, in fact, called The End of History, in which he predicted the spread of human rights, liberal democracy, and the market economy. He had changed, it's worth recalling, he had changed his tune by 1992, and he certainly changed his tune now. He is a pessimist from the right, and in fact we can read Francis Fukuyama in some senses as an intellectual weather vane, from euphoria to pessimism. From convergence in the final days of the Cold War and Western triumphalism to the cholera of our days. These are the pendular movements of our narratives of togetherness. So, we're at the Hirschman Center in Geneva, so I want to acknowledge here what will follow is a kind of Hirschmanian exercise in model building by thinking about the history of our rival concepts of the world. He once titled an anthology of his essays, Rival Views of the Market. And I want to think about rival views of the world. And a theme to consider for all of us here is the shifting power of the frameworks or the narratives of our global togetherness. And the experiment is going to unfold in 3 parts. First, I want to lay out a problem for our social sciences. Though I'm a historian, I consider history one of the provinces of the social sciences, and the problem of how to conjugate global integration with democratic life. And that there is a relationship that we need to think about, and that the stranger, secondly, and that the stranger, in a way, the margins, in the way that the event of the conference of the Hirschman Center has convoked us for, matter. Secondly, to chart the contours of a narrative that illustrates this relationship. And that will, I hope, do 2 things. One is explore some narrative styles that sought to explain the pattern of a relationship between integration and democracy. And then I'm going to focus on one moment, what I call the trans-war moment from 1914 to 1945. And I'll explain why I call it the trans-war rather than the interwar moment shortly, where we see a breakdown of both global integration and democracy simultaneously. And so history provides us with a precedent for thinking about what those relationships might look like. And then finally end with some thoughts about the history of the present. So, let's start with a coincidence. Actually, Francis Fukuyama was very fortunate. His prophecy did come at the cusp of 2 fundamental shifts. For all the pounding that he took for his prophecy, some of it warranted, some simply as a result of not having read the essay or the book of 1992, which was much more somber. He was lucky because it was an essay that did seem to foreshadow some major transformations. First of all, of course, was the spread of liberal democracy, called the Third Wave by Samuel Huntington, starting with Portugal in 1974, running through the 1980s and 1990s, gathering speed with the colored revolutions. And the second, of course, was the global fusion, which became called globalization, which is a term we should remind ourselves that was coined by Willy Brandt's commission in 1980 called the North-South, does anybody remember what the subtitle of it, Struggle for Survival or something like that? And actually, the Brandt Commission had a very different idea of what globalization should look like when they coined that term, just as an aside. It's a process that began in 1982. Have a look at that graph of the history of financialization of the US economy. With the debt crisis of Latin America that spread globally and became what we would now recognize as the hyper-financialization of the present, and the round of trade liberalization before and after the creation of the World Trade Organization in January of 1995. And we're going to talk a little bit this evening about capital mobility and its place in the model that we think about. And so this led to a lot of discussion about convergence. Then, of course, came 2008. There were the dysphoric expressions leading up to it, of course, like Chiapas in southern Mexico, to Seattle, the Battle of Seattle. But there was no fundamental structural debate until first the shock of 2008, and then the appearance of, and the data that surrounded the revelations about global and national patterns of inequality. And of course, there's some debate about whether this is the Piketty effect or the China effect. Either way, there was a recognition that there was something structural that had happened in the world economy, though no questioning about what that relationship might be to the spread and pausing, perhaps, of democracy. Now, historians have a annoying habit of deflating our claims to novelty. But in fact, there is plenty of evidence to show that global integration does, in previous eras of global integration, does have worsening effects on national and global income distribution. This was true from 1870 to 1914, and it reared its head again in 1975. With this momentary exception, the Trente Glorieuses from 1945 to the mid-1970s. That became such a celebrated moment for thinking about when Thomas Piketty argued that that was actually the exception to a more general rule about capital than the norm, though most of our modern social sciences tended to norm around the Trente Glorieuses, and that we better get used to this new kind of default. In fact, if we go back over the past 2 centuries, there have been some refrains. I want us to consider 4 cycles. This is very unhistorian of me, by the way. It's a lump so many things together. And this is the most I'm going to go to. Katrina and I were joking about how political science, where is Katrina? Okay, I don't know where she is. There you are. We're joking about 4x4. This is the closest I can get to copying you. But rather, it's history in 4 cycles with 2 upswings, as you'll see, and 2 downswings. The downswings are the trans-war period and the period from 1970 to 1990. And we have just finished writing almost 3 decades of an upswing. And the question might be, where are we now? I'm not going to point in any particular direction, though I'll try, after we look at the last major the downswing of the trans-war period, to draw some lessons about what tipping points and some variables we might think about. Now, there are 2 types of connections at stake here. One is the connection between global fusion and democratic opening, and the second, teasing this out, might provide some clues about turning points and conjunctures, what induces or triggers that swing of the pendulum from one phase of a cycle to another. Doing this implies juxtaposing and combining 2 fields of analysis that need to speak to each other more than they do. That is, thinking about democracy, especially under duress, and thinking about global integration, especially under duress. Because it's clear that that democratic processes and discontents are affecting national policies and strategies of global integration, and vice versa. It is also clear that the strains of global interdependence have profound effects on democratic tempers. So at this junction lies the importance of the figure of the stranger and how we think about global togetherness and democracy. I don't have any large causal explanations, but I'll venture some ideas. But first I have to start with some qualifications, already kind of venturing out onto the limb here, qualifications that are key to our Hirschmanian model building exercise. The most important of the qualifications, I could stack them up, but I will just talk about one, that this model of history is very Eurocentric. For the 19th century, fusions didn't always look like voluntary openings or democratic waves in many parts of Africa and Latin America. I'll give you an illustration of that shortly. In fact, quite the opposite. So we're going to have to think about integration that produces contradictory forces. The evidence, I should say, for Latin America is much more ambiguous. But let's start by bringing the stranger in. Not as one way of thinking about, I should say, given the theme of the Hirschman Center's means here, it was one way of thinking about the margins. But the stranger not as an afterthought to our thinking about global integration and democracy, or as collateral damage, or the beneficiaries of diffusion, but central to how we think about both and the linkage between integration and democracy. I'll get to the photograph, I'll explain the photograph in a minute. Now, near strangers, this is, again, a couple thousand years of global history here, near strangers had been around since biblical times. They gathered, of course, in markets and temples, and their interactions as traders were actually relatively straightforward because of the codes and rituals for inspecting merchandise. So there was a familiarity of strangers for centuries. But the pattern changed with long-distance trade. Enabled by credit instruments, imperial envoys, and other actors, there arose more intermediation that allowed distant connections, so that there could be entanglements between strangers without necessarily bringing the strangers into direct contact with each other. So the paradox of global opening was that many worlds of near strangers yielded to a larger world of distant strangers. Interdependence meant that distant strangers mattered but became less familiar. Did this pattern of distant estrangement mean unknowing? No. The global public sphere and the circulation of news and images, which I'm going to talk about a lot this evening, made sure that even though the stranger was unfamiliar to us, there was a presence of the stranger. Did this mean that everyone near was no longer a stranger? No, and I'm going to talk about this too. In fact, the process of global convergence often brought workers from distant corners in close. And now we come to the photograph taken by Jacob Riis, who was a Danish-American crime reporter in New York in the late 19th century, who published a very celebrated book called How the Other Half Lives, which was an expose of street life in New York City in the late 1880s. And the chapters of the book were organized around ethnic groups of migrants who were moving in. There was a chapter on the Hebrews, on the Italians, and so on and so forth, to give an expose. And actually, he experimented a lot with the use of flash. I'm going to talk a little bit about photography through this lecture to illuminate the dark, unknown, hidden precincts of New York life. And it was a shock to the New York bourgeoisie. So these were the near strangers brought close by the process of global integration. So we might think about the connections between near and far estrangement as part of the process of global integration. And why I use this kind of imagery was that this was not just a connected world, but an intervisible one made visible by the practices in particular of photojournalism. So that the images you're going to see where we started out and we're going to see for the rest of the lecture are not just ornamental, but they informed how protagonists developed a visual narrative about their connection to strangers. Needless to say, these kinds of images of migrants and borders have become wedge issues for many years. Brexit only pulled back the veil on the dynamic. And as the divides opened up between rival visions of society, of course, I worry more than slightly, that cosmopolitanism now seems too thin, too frail a vision of what connected ourselves to strangers. Driven by sympathy and curiosity, and I'm going to challenge the cosmopolitan thesis in just a minute, I have to confess that at the same time, cosmopolitanism may be about as much as we can hope for in this world. At the same time, I do think we have to move beyond cosmopolitanism and the language of connection and think about interdependence. So, and I should say, in passing, just since we're thinking about the place of margins, using the term interdependence in the place of interconnection, I borrow, in a sense, from the literature in Latin America on economic development, what we call dependency theory, that just to spotlight the importance of the margins, that there are also social scientific traditions that come from outside, let's say, the NATO universe that might give us some insights into the global condition. So it's another reason why thinking from the margins is important. But the margins matter to democracy when we couple our idea of estrangement, right, that global integration, that there are strangers that come close, with global integration. And this is a theme that I explore in this book that Shalini mentioned, which is kind of tentatively called Earth Hunger, Global Integration and the Need for Strangers. And it recounts the story of a great debate, one that has shaped our times, how humans came to deal with, to embrace and to resist, and they go together, their dependence upon strangers once local worlds opened up into one interconnected and interdependent world. This dawned on observers in the middle of the 19th century with new technologies of communication, as you're going to see, and transportation, new policies like free trade and state-driven long-distance flows of capitals, and new capital, and new concepts. I'm going to deal with that in just a second. One need go no further than the manifesto of the Communist Party of 1848 to get a sense of the mid-19th century shift. We read that pamphlet now as a prophecy of revolution. That, in fact, is perhaps the less interesting take, though it would be hard to understate the significance of that particular reading. But it can also be read as an account for how local worlds of, I'm going to do this unfortunate thing when Marx does the talking, Marx and Engels, feudal lords, vassals, guild masters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs, the near strangers of the bygone era, got dissolved into one world of new simplified class antagonisms of bosses and workers that recognize fewer and fewer boundaries. Marx and Engels made clear in the opening section of how we got to modern class warfare that the discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, the advent of the East India Company, and the opening of the Chinese market, trade with colonies, as they put it, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in a tottering feudal society, a rapid development, unquote. So it's for this reason that Marx and Engels predicted that the Communist Party was fated to stand at the vanguard of a new era because it brought to the fore the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. But Marx and Engels were not the only prophets. Bourgeois political economists like John Stuart Mill made very similar observations about how trade and technology laced the world's parts together. But his verdict was very different. I'm not going to read it out, so I'm just going to put it up there, from 1848, The Principles of Political Economy, Book 3, Chapter 17 on foreign trade, with a very important passage about what happens. And I make several moves here, from noting how lending across distances made the bourgeois more cosmopolitan, while at the same time making the borrowers more civilized, thus begetting a sentiment of goodwill, less alienation. And at the same time, he noted that there would be so much likeness between civilized countries that people and capital would not flow back and forth between them, and turn instead to the rude and uncivilized societies. And a few lines later, this is off the page, he argued regarding what we would call now the margins, that the opening of a foreign trade by making them acquainted with new objects, or tempting them by the easier acquisition of things which they had not previously thought attainable, sometimes works, it's a little tentative here, sometimes works a sort of industrial revolution in a country whose resources were previously undeveloped for want of energy and ambition in the people, inducing those who were satisfied with scanty comforts and little work to work harder for the gratification of their new tastes, and even to save and accumulate capital for the still more complete satisfaction of those tastes at a future time. It's a very important passage. If for Marx, the creation of long-distance trade, gathering capital into new and mobile pools, and the rise of bourgeois society sent the capitalist beyond as the new conquering hero, as he would chronicle in the pages of the New York Daily Tribune for a pivotal decade from 1852 to 1861, Mill felt that it had put an end to conquering habits. This is the key quote on that one, that it would bring peace. But what they shared was important for what's to follow here. Nowadays, especially as framed by nationalists and cosmopolitans alike, we tend to focus on the question, what problem does the stranger present us with that we must solve? So much of the attention has focused on citizenship and/or humanitarianism and charity. But Mill and Marx were posing things differently. In the idiom of interdependence, they asked, what problems do strangers solve for us? For Marx, it was relief from necessity, and for Mill, it was the escape from war as the path to wealth. It's the shift from the language of charity or pity for co-members of the political community or for the other, to that of interdependence, which was at the core of the insight that Marx and Mill had about what was changing in the middle of the 19th century that I would like us to go back to, that I think has gotten lost. That was, they argued, the global determinant of the modern condition. And it's a line of thinking I want to explore because we've lost sight of it, ironically, despite the heightened global integration. I'll just also flag the issue about capital mobility for now, because it's going to keep coiling back on us now. Now, for all their differences, what Marx and Mill, so if you can't see the back, these are global submarine cables. For all their differences, what Marx and Mill recognized was the making of an age in which local worlds were becoming entangled with and interdependent upon other worlds. Theirs were visions at a moment of opening, at one point in our four cycles. One last little definition of what is estrangement, I define as that process of integrating the outsider into the new global hierarchy. Stranger, because that person is no longer an outsider, integrated in systems, now being integrated into systems of exchange and exploitation, but not part of the decision-making so long as we frame the units that support or defend public goods in purely national and state terms. So the question for us is how to think about strategies for refamiliarizing the stranger in the way communities and networks did before the nation gripped our concept of political life. So as the 19th century unfolds and gives us the beginnings of the modern cosmopolitan imaginary, And there's an example of a Venetian photographer that kind of sets the stage for the book. It's an example of cosmopolitan fascination. He was also really the founder of modern war photography. But this cosmopolitan curiosity about others gave way to a sense of dependency upon strangers. Seen over the long run, global interdependence has been the source of hopes and horrors, of one world dreaming, and of unspeakable atrocities. And in our day of climate change and nation firsters, how we handle this fragile togetherness will shape the lives of generations to come. But it's worth recalling, just as the dawn of this opening, this is Felice Beato was the first to photograph the Forbidden Palace. Half a century later, by the 1890s, that sense of opening gave way to a sense of closing, of anxiety, and of rising nativism. And of course, a spasm of imperial wars. In 1893, the American historian Frederick Jackson Turner will announce in a famous address that the American frontier is now closed. A few years later, or actually just a year later, Japan will declare war on China. French, British, Russian, and U.S. observers at the time will become increasingly anxious about the spread of Japanese power in the Pacific. 5 years later, the United States will declare war on Spain, in part as a preemptive struggle to prevent Japan from taking the Philippines. Then came the Boer War, itself the response to anxieties about spreading German presence in southern Africa. And it was the liberal reformer economist John Hobson who was sent to cover the Boer War for the Manchester Guardian, who came back from South Africa, horrified by what he saw, sat down to write in 1902 a book called Imperialism. And in Imperialism, he asked himself, what is driving Europeans for the conquering habits? And he concluded that it was a case of earth hunger. So while this was going on, it's worth saying that these integration of strangers into these imperial orbits was also the source of scandal. Scandal about the condition of strangers that Europeans were submitting them to, and the effects in return on life at home. That was a crucial development. Let's just give you one image of this. These are images taken by an American engineer who'd gone up the Amazon to the Putumayo area. His name is Walter Hardenberg, who wrote an expose in 1913 called The Devil's Paradise about the rubber business in the Amazon and the exploitation of native peoples of the region for the wealth of the Arana business and the Amazonian Rubber Company, which was incorporated in London. This, in turn, led to a public scandal on both sides of the Atlantic and to an official investigation led by Roger Casement, and here he is, in the Putumayo as the white humanitarian savior who would address the House of Commons in 1914 and urge that the House of Commons charge the shareholders of the Peruvian Amazon company, rubber company, of violating anti-slave laws. So in both the scandal of what happened in the Amazon and a few years earlier in the Congo, which is what made Casement so famous, and the movement of which he was a part and many other late Victorian humanitarians, he made some important fusions. There was a connection between unfree labor in the Amazon and in Africa, monopoly trade, prices for commodities at home, and shareholder complicity. There was also a connection between distant abuses, corporate responsibility, and the quality of parliamentary democracy at home. The focus of attention on Belgian Parliament was whether it was able to oversee the powers of King Leopold, and in the case of House of Commons, whether it was going to enforce national laws on subjects who were violating them. And so the ability to enforce their own anti-slavery legislation. Now, the same year that Hardenberg issued his Devil's Paradise, Norman Angell, who may be familiar to you here as he spent some time in Geneva, published a popular edition of a book called The Great Illusion. He was a peace activist, a Labour MP. He also studied at the University of Geneva. And the Great Illusion made the case that growing interdependence meant that Europeans had no interest in war. For the cost of war was so great that no one had an interest in starting one. This was the triumph of credit and consumption. We recall very often Angel's book as one of epic bad timing. I mean, if Francis Fukuyama lucked out in 1989, Angel did not. But it's worth reading the book because he did raise a fear that the arrival of mass democracy, and this is where democracy enters the story, at home might induce demagogues to play the nationalist card, and in so doing push governments to move towards more competitive policies and away from cooperative, peaceful ones. So by 1914, we can find two styles of argument about global integration, and I think we still live in the trail of these styles of arguments. One is of the triumph of enlightened self-interest, from Mill to Angel, more hopeful about a more just and progressive world, that prosperity was good for social mobility, that social mobility on the whole was good for democracy. So global interdependence, as Albert Hirschman might have put it, internationalized Montesquieu's du commerce thesis, whereby private actors' passions would be channeled into healthy interests. State authorities at the same time would be forced to curb their predatory inclinations. The second line of argument was the triumph of narrowed self-interest, of Marx and of Casement, that was more despairing, more pessimistic. With growing fears about the concentrations of wealth, anxiety about competition and war, and the constraints put on democracy. And so we begin to see the divides between the Cassandras and the cornucopians. If that was the landscape at the end of the first or Victorian globalization, these arguments got put to the test in the ensuing backlash. I want to spend a few minutes looking at the interwar or transwar period and then conclude. Because it was after World War I that global thinkers were compelled to think globally, and as we think about and consider the centenary of the end of the First World War now, we can look back to the century that was created by it. They were motivated by a search for new coordinates to avoid what had happened in 1914, and provided new thinking about interdependence and its effects on democracy. We begin to see the fusion of these two sides of the coin. And new thinking about the role of democracy in the shaping of interdependence. So let's start with one writer. This is the American edition of what was published in 1919, one of the best-selling, another book I highly recommend reading. It never goes stale. And we remember it now as a debate about what he called the Carthaginian peace that was imposed by the Allies, especially on Germany. But what we forget, and this is why it should be reread, was the first long opening narrative about the world. And Keynes made two observations there. The first was that 400 years of opening with the New World integration after 1492 had now come to a close. That creating that first massive act of estrangement, the dispossession, these are my words, the dispossession of natives and the importation of slaves, was now closed. The Americas, as Mill had prophesized, remember, and now Keynes recognized, was looking more like Europe. It was industrializing, it was urbanizing. And so it meant that the old complementarities of what Adam Smith had called the wastelands, or we might call the margins, to European cities and European industries that built the Eurocentric world order was now permanently destabilized. That was one problem. And the other was that the global balance of debt accumulating before 1914, and this is why we have to think about capital mobility, and now thrown into disequilibrium by the costs of war, now presented a new phase of interdependence. And that new phase required that Germany be made to repay war costs of France and Britain so that allies could honor their obligations to New York financiers. It meant now that a crippled German economy was at the heart of the global payment system. and so the subject of a new kind of stranger. And I just did the illustration of Eglantine Jebb, who, and this is a photograph taken in, and a set of pamphlets that she issued in May of 1919, where she exhibited on Trafalgar Square posters of starving German children after the war, and saying we should not just care about our own children, but care about the children of our enemies. It was very controversial. She was also the founder of Save the Children as a result of this experience. So the new pattern of there was a new pattern of interdependence now with the end of 400 years of the enclosure of the Americas, incorporation of it into the Afro-Eurasian trading system, and to the new problem of debt. Enter the change also, the political landscape. That mass democracy at the crest of that first wave, which would end, of course, in 1922 with Mussolini's takeover, would not tolerate the old mechanisms of adjustment that handled the interdependence of old, which had rested on the gold standard. But in every way, British and French elites did not recognize the new pattern of interdependence and the realities of the fragility of the payment system that rested on a very rigid gold standard in a democratic age. They had created a disequilibrium at the core of the model of global integration. And this was not sustainable given the new mechanisms of democratic legitimation. Now, Keynes was painted as a crank. There was a very disputed book, and the prophecy did not come to pass immediately. One of the critical reasons why had to do with U.S. lending and debt renegotiations. I won't go into detail about how that was handled through the 1920s. But so long as capital functioned as an integrator, as both Marx and Mill had signaled, the underlying troubles were contained. And so the 1920s give us a picture, I thought you could get some local imagery here, of rising internationalism, self-avowed internationalism. The League of Nations, historians have been spending a lot of time recently on reinterpreting the League of Nations. This institution, the lattice work of foundations, think tanks, monitoring agents like the Toynbee report that would go and examine the violence and atrocities of the Greco-Turkish War, which I'll get to shortly. New practices like the Save the Children, Nansen passports, the ILO, and so forth. So out of what was made a visible war, and photography had its effects, came a humanitarian infrastructure, and even an effort to ban war, the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, recently explored by Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro. And it's worth remembering that this pact, remembering that the Nuremberg trials held the charged guilty for having violated this treaty, right? Not for crimes against humanity. So, if you don't know what the Kellogg-Briand Pact argued, was it outlawed war as a measure of statecraft. Well, that was the first bequest of 1919, right? That global integration appeared to favor a continuation of interdependence with a concern for the welfare of the stranger, hence the humanitarian structure. But how far can we push this? Well, if we listen to strangers, not too far. This picture, and why it's been framed as the interwar period, is seen as a moment of peace between two world wars. We might also call a trans-war period that sees a much more continuous period of violence, especially if we look at it from a global context. And for that, let's turn to a second figure, the counterpoint to John Maynard Keynes, a different kind of witness, a different kind of stranger, one might say, who wrote self-consciously from the other side of the veil in 1919. And his name was W.E.B. Du Bois, a different kind of, not exactly the white savior, who was, of course, on hand for the Pan-African meetings in Paris in 1919 had tried to meet with Woodrow Wilson at the time to insist that to try to make the case for minority rights that were being created within Europe be rights that might apply also to the Negro race at home. He would return, he did not get his audience with Woodrow Wilson. He would return to the United States that summer, only to encounter the savagery of lynching. These are photographs from Omaha, what was called the Red Summer because of the specter of communism, but it was also red for the blood that flowed from the mass lynchings across the United States. And he would return and write a piercing work called The Souls of White Folk, which ruminated on the fear and loathing of strangers. It is the duty of white Europe, he growled, to divide up the darker world and administer it for Europe's good. Colonies are where niggers are cheap and the earth is rich. And he found it amazing that the United States and its sanctimonious president saw itself as a peacemaker and a moral protagonist, but while he argued that no nation is less fitted for this role. What fueled his loathing was their dependence on strangers. In Amritsar, in Beijing, in Baghdad, Buenos Aires, and Berlin, violence continued. The armistice held in some places of the world, but war went on and took new forms elsewhere, which reminds us and brings to the fore a dilemma that Hannah Arendt had posed about the Enlightenment promise a few years later of bringing universal claims, but the only way to have those rights was to be a citizen of particular states. But the habits of empire, that integration made freedom and democracy possible in some parts of the world, was at the expense of others. We think of Du Bois's color line. For those of you who aren't familiar with Du Bois's work, he's sort of the founder of African American intellectual history, and coined the idea of the color line as something that divides America, but also divides the black soul. And so Americans read Du Bois as an American tale, but it's worth saying that he always thought of the United States as a province in a wider racial global social structure. And the battle over race and ethnicity at home was being echoed in faraway places. The Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 22 brought a young reporter for the Toronto Star, a man called Ernest Hemingway, to relay stories about atrocities there. Almost 50,000 soldiers died, but almost 2 million people displaced, 1.5 million Orthodox Christians, many ethnic Greeks, fleeing to Anatolia, where 500,000 Muslim Greeks were uprooted to, quote, independent Turkey. What this does is lay bare the simultaneity of divergent narratives. The 1920s represented a kind of escalating standoff between two different narratives or view and responses to global integration, of nationalism and ethnic cleansing on the one hand, with immigration controls and exclusions in the United States, Canada, Brazil, Australia, and elsewhere, and internationalism on the other, but also of faltering democracies like Italy's, Peru's, which would foreshadow wider problems. So here we get to the paradox that we have to wrestle with, the paradox of 1919. For the peacemakers of 1919 contained global disorder after the war by limiting the spread of sovereign nation states so that the global hierarchy would be governed by a club. This had important implications for how we think about what's happened in more recent times. I'll get to that in the conclusion. But at the same time, it relied on nation-states to manage the hazards and risks of the new market order. The first would inflame anti-colonial sentiment and demands for voice at home. The second did nothing to thwart the competitive urges of states that Keynes worried about. So that democracies in Asia, and Du Bois would tour China and Japan in the mid-1930s. It was a very important travelogue. I urge you to read it. Europe, Latin America, and North America were vulnerable to these nationalist urges. For Du Bois in particular, only too aware of the potentially lethal effects of white majoritarian or hegemonic power. So we have this contradictory picture. And sure enough, the contradictions would unfold. Just to look at this graph, this is from the Hathaway and Shapiro database. You can look it up. So I re-aggregated some of the data. You probably can't see it in the far back. So these are number of war casualties by decade. I end in 1939 because I don't want to include what most people call the Second World War, though I would argue in some sense that the Second World War begins in 1937, which is how I'm going to end this talk. But you'll see on the one hand, casualties, interstate casualties, infrastate is the orange line, non-state casualties. So you'll see, and they're aggregated by a decade. Note, among other things, the 50-50 ratio of civil and international wars rising, so that there is a relationship between mass estrangement and extermination at the same time. The coincidence of violence against near strangers and far strangers at the same time. And this, of course, correlates, this violence and war correlates with the breakdown of democratic regimes and the breakdowns of global integration that would mark the end of the first wave. Well, what happened? How did global disintegration intersect with mass estrangement and democratic breakdown? What are some of the takeaways for our present? Well, two clues. One was, of course, the response to the economic shock. 1929 spurred sauve qui peut competitive policy making. It's all well known. I'm not going to go through it. But I just want you to look at this graph of capital mobility. Again, this is, 1924, you can see the effect of sliding, of the crash in 1929, a bounce back up of capital mobility after that, actually, and then collapse with the end of the gold standard. The seizure of the payment system took the shock of the 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariffs and would create a cascade of competitive policy makings. The abandonment of the gold standard and currency fluctuations, fluctuating prices, balance of payments problems, and thus the urge to adopt competitive devaluations, more protection, and the cascading disequilibrium. By 1931-32, major powers, in that conjuncture, major powers responding to this would create blocs, trading blocs. In the summer of 1932, in particular, in Ottawa, I like the photograph on the right-hand side in particular because photographers start appearing in photographs and they become part of the show. But the Ottawa meetings of the Commonwealth members came together to create special imperial preferences. It's important to note then, and special imperial preferences for the members of the imperial club at the exclusion of others. What's important here is that the decisions like the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the Ottawa agreements, in the United States and in Great Britain, the self-anointed wardens of liberal internationalisms as the first exiteers. Sound familiar? This would then be a cue to other powers and empires. If you didn't have an empire yet, as Italy did not, as Germany did not, or Japan did not, you better get one. And by 1933, the margins were also at the same time getting remaindered. That is, that the options for markets and allies for countries that were left out of these blocs or being forced into these blocs, their options were shrinking. In Argentina, rising anxiety about being able to export beef that would lead to the infamous Roca-Runciman Pact. Central and southeastern Europe, caught with non-convertible currencies tied to the German Reichsmark, forced then into the arms of the German economic orbit. And by 1938, a young economist who'd been studying in Italy began to record the trade imbalances between Germany and Central and Southeastern European partners, and noted that the global turmoil did not incentivize decoupling. Right? And note, Donald Trump is not anti-global. It simply shifted the incentive to creating encased, asymmetrical trading blocks with hegemons and subaltern partners, to create an extractive model. It's not anti-global, it's anti-multilateral. Its purpose was to cut off options for margins, and could do this by reimagining strangers through filters of race and narratives of survival. I'll get to in just a minute. But who is that economist? It was the young Albert Hirschman. And he had this insight that the price for this new model of integration through trading blocks would be paid for by weaker partners through a kind of neo-mercantilism. And Albert Hirschman's first book, this would lead to the publication of his first book. You can almost see the origins of his thinking in Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, in his early work and his anti-fascist struggles. And here is a takeaway for you, for the ones who are more conceptually inclined, that the costs of exit for a marginal or a dependent country can give you an index of the level of asymmetry in the codependent relationships between the subaltern and the hegemon. So you can think of exit in two ways: as powerful countries exit from the multilateral frameworks in favor of bilateral extractive models of accumulation, and so that the price of exit that is paid for by exit is lower for them if the costs can be somehow externalized. There's a second way this functions, that is exit for the margins, like Southeast Europe or Argentina, where alternatives were getting closed off, they had fewer exits, that the price of leaving the subaltern arrangement with the powerful partner was rising. What's more, he noted in that book, is that this favors the spread of authoritarian regimes. This is where democracy comes back into the story. By the end of 1933, world trade had fallen by 1/3 of the level of 1929. There would be a slow recovery thereafter, especially within these trading blocks. So interdependence was being recomposed. This political economy, however, unfolded against a wider backcloth of cultural and intellectual invitations, which invites us to think about our social science narratives in our own present. The process of reimagining strangers that created the enabling conditions for this model of trade. For the response to scarcity and limits, which we saw anticipated in the 1890s anxiety, yielded two very important turns in the 1920s and the 1930s. One was about population and race. I'm going to just whip through this. And a turn to biological conceptions of progress and the dehumanization of strangers. I could go on in detail about the importance of demography, of eugenics, and the ways in which national identities were being racialized. In fact, the wholesale anthropomorphizing of state and interstate relations. There was another shift in the concept of resources, fears of diminishing returns, a resurgent Malthusian panic, and many examples of this. I won't go into detail, except that people were starting to think about resource interdependence in new kinds of ways, and fearing diminishing returns and increasing scarcity, which intensified the perceived need for grabbing resources while you could. And I should add, just while we're doing this, actually Geneva plays an important role in all this because increasing numbers of agronomists, demographers, land tenure studies, agrarian economics will go out into the field. These are photographs of China. Would be important for creating this increased sense of both global enclosure and global scarcity. It's against the backdrop of this, I might add, that Pearl Buck would write The Good Earth in 1932 with an anxiety about land. In fact, the story of Wang Lung, who's the chief protagonist in that amazing novel, is a kind of peril about the fragility of property and the obsession with soil and blood. So Brazil to the Amazon, the Japanese to Manchuria, and of course the Nazis to the eastern frontier. So it was the combination of new racial keys and anxiety about resources and neo-Malthusianism spurred the rising competition, the dropping restraints on expansionist behavior, and narratives of survival creating a global panic. Which brings us back to the paradox of 1919, from the defamiliarization of the stranger to the dehumanization of the stranger, and the rise of geopolitics to explain or to account for this new kind of, I'm going to skip through this one, there's the rise of international relations, and it grows out of this moment. We can argue about when this begins. 1914, one might say, is what puts it in motion. But by 1935, there was a point of no return. On the 6th of December 1935, 6 Italian planes bombed Gondar in Abyssinia in the name of a minor border dispute, but justified as a free labor, as a campaign against slave labor in Abyssinia. In the weeks afterwards, warplanes would target more villages, and by the time it showered Desi, it aimed at Red Cross nursing stations and mission bases. And the arsenal would include incendiary and shrapnel bombs. So while some had fantasized about frontiers as being, or fringes or margins as being places where we might experimental zones for farmers to solve the Malthusian crisis, it was also a lab for total war from the air against strangers. The horror was splashed across newspapers, but it was not photographed. It's worth saying on January 30th, 1936, just a few blocks away, Emperor Haile Selassie would address the League of Nations and warned of the effects of the bombs and the war on innocence by saying, "It is us today, and it will be you tomorrow." While he spoke, Italian delegates heckled and jeered him. And one of the witnesses of this episode was a South African journalist, George Steer, who plays a curious role in this story, who was a writer for the Times, and this is why the journalism, the making this intervisible is important to the story, wrote the story about what had happened in Abyssinia, brought shame, and there was a controversy in Britain at the time because it had just given Mussolini concessions for what they called corridors for camels. But shortly thereafter, the Spanish Civil War broke out in the summer, and the Times sent Street from Africa to Spain in early 1937. And he was working from the Basque Country, reporting on how British merchant vessels were getting around the Franquist blockade of Bilbao. News arrived in early April 27th that a nearby village had been bombed. He and a guy called Holmes from Reuters, monks from the Daily Express, Corman from Ce Soir, got into a car and drove immediately to the town of Guernica. The result was famous reportage, especially Street's in-depth interviews and photographs of what happened. It was his stories that chronicled the markings of the Junker dive bombers and the Henkels and their repeated sorties as he would document from survivors and witnesses. And these would soon be translated into Le Monde and L'Humanité, the first photographs of aerial bombardments of civilians. This is, and you can kind of see me, the reflection of me in the glass here. I thought you might also be interested that the announcement of the death of Gramsci coincides. This is what Pablo Picasso was reading and looking at when he was trying to figure out what to paint for his commissioned piece for the Paris World Fair. If you look at his preliminary sketches from December to April 19th, he was clearly laboring to capture the drama. His themes were all too familiar, almost derivative, and he knew it. The one anomaly leading up to April 19th was the raised defiant fist in the middle. On April 28th, so a few days afterwards, he learned of the atrocity. This is from one side, the before and after learning of the news of Guernica. He learned of the atrocity from reading L'Humanité and Ce Soir. And in L'Humanité, it was the translations of George Street's articles. In a fury of a few weeks, he would create the most famous mural of atrocity. On May 1st, producing the first sketch, and by 4th of June, the monumental canvas was complete. On May 1st, the agony of the cheval would appear. And the final mural, in black and white, like the photographs he was looking at. It's worth adding that in 1936, the same year that the war broke out, Henry Luce would found Life magazine, a very important magazine for the spread of war photography that would bring the atrocities of war back home. This is the famous image by Robert, the Hungarian-born photographer Kappa. In 1937, Japan invaded China, where my mother was born and forced to flee. Hitler watched with fascination, met with a strategist who'd spent a lot of time in Japan, Karl Haushofer. Dateline 1937. It ends on scenes of global disintegration, democratic collapse, and the coercive model of incorporating strangers. Also made now intervisible to illustrate how global it had become. They ask us, this year, 1937, asks us to think about how actors understood interdependence and the place of strangers. So the final takeaways. I have a number of them. One, how to reckon with the ambivalence about strangers. This is the New York Times yesterday as I checked into my hotel room in Geneva. The Mélange almost speaks about it. The recent thinking of our moment often is taking place in historical analogies. Adam Tooze has argued that we are in a 1914 moment. Timothy Snyder argues that we are in a 1933 moment. One is economic, the other more political, both, however, focused on Europe, both thinking in terms of allies and rivals. We have to be more global. How can we bring the stranger in? How can the place of the stranger affect the balance between cooperation and competition? And this is where the narrative about strangers matters. But it's much more fragile than the cosmopolitan consensus ever admitted. For the cosmopolitan imaginary rests on assumptions about how people narrate self-interest, opportunities, and threats. Codependency between strangers is both the source of euphoria and fear at the same time. And we better learn to reckon with that ambivalence about the stranger, the person upon whom one depends but will never know and is defamiliarized. Number two, exit and the global history of democracy. First point to note here is that while democratic and despotic regimes exited from the multilateral frameworks of that trans-war period and to create blocs and behaved as rivals, the most extractive of the regimes were not democratic. Yet, it was the democratic regimes, as Angel and Keynes had warned, that were the first to defect from the wobbly global payment system. Pessimists like Marx, Casement, and Du Bois would have answered that that payment system held only as long as elites had an economic interest in it and had less to do with their commitments to democracy. If anything, for the pessimists, a real internationalism, a real model of solidarity would have required a change in the social structure. Either way, it set in motion a panic. And we have to question the 19th century assumptions about the natural harmony between self-interest, codependency, and peace. These are contingent on economic and cultural forces. And we also have to admit some truths about Anglo-American exceptionalist narratives about global leadership and democracy. 3, why do margins matter? It's what we're talking about these days. 1, as I said just now, the place of strangers and perceived access to margins created expectational frameworks. Secondly, thinking about margins reminds us that the integration is hierarchical and asymmetrical. For if democracy placed coordination burdens on interdependence, breakdowns had disparate effects on democracy. It would unleash anti-constitutional demons in Brazil, Argentina, Germany, Spain, where we would have coups d'etats or civil wars, each of them having been reliant on conjunctural class coalitions that were dependent on the organization of the world economy, and were compelled to reset within. So some countries responded by democratic breakups, but even within the surviving democracies, there was a profound reset and a fitful struggle to make them more inclusive. Well, what made the difference? Well, there were no doubt institutional explanations, the class alliances, but I would throw in the importance of cognitive frameworks and the handling of fear. For when the scrambling ensued, it tended to favor the dictators, and dictators liked to scramble. And you can go back to that graph of the violence, and it's correlated with dictatorship. But this model of interdependence, engagement with strangers, saw tradecraft as a means of statecraft, commerce as war, not versus war. So we need to think more about the relationship between extraction and democracy, and that democratic governments are not immune from turning towards the extractive option. Finally, let's go back to our 4 cycles. Global integration coincided with democratic opening. Disintegration coincided with backsliding and dehumanization. The social scientists out there will ask, is there a causal relationship, or were there causal relationships, and what might they be? Well, on the upswing, opening and democratization reinforced each other, and on the downswing, tensions opened up. But what caused what? For ordo-globalists, it's the fear of mass democracy intruding on free market forces that was the specter haunting globalization. For democratic theorists, it's the risks and detachments of globalization that drained the liberal consensus, Francis Fukuyama. But let's return, in the end, to our basic paradox and ask, is there a tension between what are the tensions within this model of interdependence? To tackle that, we have to go back to the paradox of global fusions of interests of strangers while creating national democracies for citizens, hoping that democracies can manage the risks and hazards of global interdependence, hoping that global interdependence would yield the bounties that would make democracies work. In 1919, a century ago, the solution was to draw a circle around the expanding national sovereignties. The big shift since 1919, what has changed the landscape now, has been the long history of decolonization. One of the main drivers of the post-1945 globalization and Francis Fukuyama's liberal internationalist imaginary has been the expanding of sovereignty and democracy, and that this curbed extractive temptations because formal empires were decomposing. But with the end of the Cold War and market integration, and particularly of Chinese integration into the world market, that long period has come to a close, with 2 effects. One, of rising competition and the rising cost of norm and rule enforcement, and the declining cost of exit for strong states. And second, one of the unintended effects was that became clear in the mature moment of this phase was the effect on inequality. For market integration does widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots. It was clear in the Victorian period, and it's been clear since 1975. When integration yields inequality, it motivates a critique of interdependence and siren calls of exit from the multilateral constraining norms and agreements. And this specter has returned. With it, redoubles the temptation to extraction, to turn against strangers in a new round of dehumanization. And here I think the place of inequality has to be central to the picture that we draw. But the backlash doesn't always have to require that citizens feel objectively worse off. For the Hirschman readers out there, you'll be familiar with the tunnel effect. It's only important that people feel subjectively or comparatively worse off. So I'm asked if I'm a pessimist. It's too early to tell. The recent wave since the 2010s have yielded all kinds of warning signs. At the same time, the extractive logic has never been more naked. And the choices are clear, as it was for Francis Fukuyama in 1989. In contrast, there was no choice. We, however, do face choices. We can despair about the specter of illiberal democracy and the cracking internationalism. You can go down the list, right? The dismantling of the arms control regime, the failure to curb the carbon emissions curve fast enough, and of course the spreading migrant crisis. But we can also take this as an opportunity of a choice that confronts us to rethink our relationship with and our commitments to strangers far and near. Thank you very much. Sure. This is kind of set up tantalizingly as an Oprah thing.
Yes, exactly. You can have a seat and have a glass of water, or you may want to stand or walk around as you please. We won't constrain you to this. So thank you very, very much for this fascinating and really sweeping talk. I'm not going to start off with a comment or a question, but open immediately to the floor in the interest of time. And just let us know who would like to begin with a question. Let me come down to you and pass the mic.
Thanks. So starting where you left off, I'm hoping everybody in the room would rather the latter consequence. So any lessons from history about what we can do to ensure that we learn from the history and take the more positive route rather than ending up repeating the same old cycle?
Well, I mean, the cheap answer from historians, which historians dole out all the time, of course, is not to forget. You know, and as Eric Hobsbawm famously said, that historians specialize in reminding people of the things that they would prefer not to remember. Which is why, in a sense, I go back to 1919 and not think of it only as the birthplace of sort of liberal internationalism, but think of many of the unresolved or the darker side of the story about the birth of what we would consider after a century later, as it's on its fumes here, what those other stories were about. Not just to have a critical historiography, but to understand that how strangers were brought into the picture pose some unsettling questions about, let's say, the cosmopolitan concerns that dominated at the time. So I think history, there's a reminder side to this. I think there are some objective lessons about precarity of the system. So this is why I started out with the Francis Fukuyama moment where it felt like predestination, that history had ended and so forth. And in that euphoric moment, when some critical decisions might have been made if people had been more skeptical about those sorts of arguments, that might not have yielded to these. And we can go through the list of what those might have been. NATO expansion. I mean, how we handled global finance when there were some people who were actually arguing for reforms that got swept under the carpet. So if there's one takeaway, it's to be always very skeptical about either very euphoric or very pessimistic arguments one way or the other, and to find ways in which they can get conjoined. This is the kind of Hirschmanian solution to this. If you get too pessimistic, you will always be able to find reasons for feeling optimistic, which is why I'm kind of recasting this as an opportunity for debate, to imagine a different kind of globalization than the one that Francis Fukuyama, I'm just holding him as the puppet for something much larger and more important, that we could go back to and have what might be called a refounding moment for globalism, and not think that this is the only version we could have.
Yes, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. I want to go back on two concepts. Sorry. One is the distant stranger and the concept of extraction. And the last 20 years, we've had actually a new dimension emerging, which is technology, the digitalization of economies, which is redefining the stranger and the way we define trust. And hence, maybe new types of technologies might maybe drive the markets from extraction to integration, or let's say collaboration. So I was wondering if you had maybe a view as to maybe a new type of models emerging. Thank you.
I have to, I am just a historian, so I can't prophesize anything. I just had lunch with a colleague, former student of mine called Glenn Whale, who's all high on Bitcoin and thinking about alternative, hyper-decentralized democratic systems, post-liberal. So there is a lot of interesting thinking going on about the possibilities of technology. Let me just, on the visuals here, one thing I would caution people to conclude is that photography or images of people in distress or suffering far away necessarily produces empathy. So one of the reasons why the images are always put out there, there was an effort on the part of the founders of Save the Children and so on to use images to drum up with the assumption that people would identify with the suffering of strangers. That was key to the cosmopolitan imagination. And it was very important for those who argued in the age of Facebook, now that it may be ending, that this would make everybody friends, right? Being able to see what was happening in distant places. I think we're starting to see some of the seamy side of all of that story. But that's a debate that would happen even at the very beginning of photography. People argued that, in fact, what photographs did is make more visual the distance between people. And hence the difference between near and far strangers. I mean, we could go into that, and how photography produces intervisibility without familiarity. Anyway, sort of end on that. But so I'm also not thinking that going online and the digital revolution is going to transform everything. Although I am experimenting with teaching a course with we talk about this, but a course without walls, based in Princeton, with refugee camps in Africa and the Middle East. There are no doubt that these new technologies can enable certain patterns and models of collaboration. I think we're extremely early days of this, though. And the dark side of it has also been manifest.
Yeah, it is on. I wanted to follow up with a more pessimistic question along those lines, which you segued to nicely, which is the way in which these digital technologies might actually be reconstructing who's a stranger and who's not, by creating these sort of parallel universes. I mean, this is so clear in U.S. politics, right? That the pro-Trump camp and the anti-Trump camp, we do not share the same reality practically. Information is completely different. What is truth? Whom to trust? The whole fake news phenomenon. I think we saw a similar thing in Brazil that helped to fuel the Bolsonaro victory. So that's, I think, one of the darker sides, but it might be redefining who's a stranger. I mean, we're strangers in our own town or in our own family, or that's fueled in part by these parallel universes in which we're living, partly because of social media. And then I had another question, which is completely different, which is I was kind of surprised you didn't invoke Polanyi at all. Because I often think, wow, you know, Polanyi was right. We seem to be moving in a similar direction. So I wonder whether you do invoke him in the larger project.
Well, so on the proliferation of strangers, right, near and far, and being estranged by, including estranged in your own families when you have ideological disagreement. Anybody, friends of mine in Brazil, you know, not talking to siblings over the election. I mean, things have really broken down. That the very same symbols can mean totally contradictory things to different people. I mean, a question to raise is whether the technology is the cause or the driver of this, and this is where I'd go back to inequalities, go back to other deeper structural issues that were, you know, sewn into the model of globalization, or what Danny Roderick calls hyperglobalization, that got sutured together really from the 1970s onwards, rather than just see it as, you know, the effect of social media. So I tend to kind of look slightly elsewhere, which doesn't mean it doesn't have a propellant effect. But fear-mongering, you know, when Du Bois goes back to the United States from Paris in 1919, it was alive there too. So just, and I've been reading a lot recently about the Greco-Turkish War, very similar patterns afoot, villages being torn apart, that had been neighbors for generations. So never discount the effects that a shock might have on what you think is, you know, a well-sewn together society. We need to be open to these kinds, that societies aren't as resilient as we sometimes think they are. Polanyi. I have to say, I used to be a big fan of Polanyi. It's kind of a long story of my encounters with him, but I would say I went back and read him very carefully, and was not, I was a little dismayed. I don't know if any Polanyiites out here, he's kind of getting a second wind now as people are thinking about an alternative frameworks, like some alternative to basically to Marxism, I think, for the left, that the Great Transformation, which was a book, you know, he publishes in 1944, would provide a kind of intellectual compass for. I think it's not very good history. Even his problems with liberalism throughout, I think putting the problems of what had happened to the foot of liberalism is a caricature of the debates that were happening in the 1920s and 1930s that he was part of, but somehow gets erased. It kind of misses. So I don't know that we're going to get a whole lot of mileage out of him. I could go on, but I was very sad to kind of read him and then have to let him go. I mean, as a reference for thinking about, which is why to be honest, the person who to me is much more powerful is Du Bois. I mean, he has some astonishingly insightful comments, and he's much more global than Polanyi was, who never really left Central Europe, even though Great Transformation was written in the United States.
So I guess in some ways this follows on from the invocation of Du Bois, which is, are we thinking enough about the arrangement of violence when we're thinking about the possibilities of dependence? So does it matter that from the 1940s we've had a hegemon with a capacity for a forever war anywhere, and also forever policing domestically, where violence can penetrate into the smallest of nooks and crannies? What does it actually mean to think of dependence in those contexts? Can we not, I mean, one might take seriously the idea that it's actually, from a lot of perspectives, always felt like extraction all along with a veneer. And is it then useful to invoke the stranger versus, you know, the sort of language that Chantal Mouffe might raise in terms of agonism? And might that be productive in the context of a very, very violent hegemonic actor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't yet got to the chapters really on the post-war years, and hence I just jumped right over it in the narrative. There's no question that Pax Americana and the Trente Glorieuses were that post-45 period were strongly correlated with each other and did have another side to them, which wasn't always so visible until, and we can spend a lot of time on this one, until it started to actually kind of become visible with the conjunction of civil rights struggles in the United States and the Vietnam War. And there's a whole riff that I've done on how those two spool together, and the heir to Du Bois is king in some ways, and which revealed the violence that had been lurking below the surface. But there is no question that the price for exit, just to come back to the model, with a hegemon or a leviathan like that, was very high, and that was one way to rebuild the multilateral system post-45 was with a power like that, which is one of the reasons why I say the exit of the Anglo-American exceptionalists in our day lowers the cost of, or the penalties for exit for everybody else. And that's the danger. Whether it was an extractive model, as you kind of hinted at, I mean, some people would obviously argue that it was extractive, but I would say that that is also a narrative that social scientists created that would create, and you use the word dependency and not interdependence, I noticed, that would inform Latin American dependency theory, right? That the only way to get development to happen in Latin America was to break away from or reimagine the global economic order. This is why I'm trying to go back to the language that Marx and Mill gave us at the beginning, which actually dependency theory is one way to get back to it, to make a case for recognizing the logics of interdependence, but not make the assumptions that, say, Mill, Angel, and others made, that there would be a natural gravitational pull that would allow sharing or pooling of self-interest to yield to a democratic peace. That there is always the temptation to predation and extraction, and it never really goes away. And so what Jews do is reread the Talmud every year in order to remind yourself of the things that can happen, right? And why we should be studying history as reminders of the fragility of these arrangements. And people lampooned Francis Fukuyama, but at the time, for this kind of caricature of history. But it did represent a consensus of that moment, which is why, just to go back, I think now the crisis allows us to address some things that there was no oxygen for 30 years ago.
So if
So I just wanted to build on what you said just now and think about if Marx and Mills are actually alluding to the architecture of political economy
Yeah.
in different domains to argue for interdependence.
Yeah.
How are you arguing interdependence? On the basis of ideas, on learning from history? And does that build interdependence as we move forward?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. But at the same time, as you'll see, throughout is that the history of the social sciences is part of that history. And that even our own theories about what we think is going on provide us both clues to, the history of those concepts provides clues to the present, but also that those concepts and insights are very historically contingent. All right. So that would be my own voice. I think there are others arguing with different kinds of voices for trying to, let's say, the early days of going beyond the cosmopolitan, thinking that sympathy and curiosity for others would promote global togetherness. I think the realization is that is not strong enough, right? And which is why I'm trying to push a harder vocabulary about codependency, not only to be realistic about it, but also to leave room, frankly, for people's very ambivalent relationships about being dependent on strangers and having strangers dependent on them, so that we can understand the backlash in order to transcend it. This is the impasse for, I'll speak for myself, for progressives right now, is we do not have a good answer for it that doesn't collapse back into the other side's dichotomies. So, hence the excavation.
So just maybe two quick comments and a question. I think what might be interesting is, you have a really large macro historical sweep. But so if one takes up the last comments that you made, I think someone like Levinas and also read in conjunction with Gandhi would be interesting, because it's basically also, it's not just about institutions and the economy, but it's about changing. If you want empathy at some level, it is about the face of the other and the ability to recognize suffering in somebody who is a fellow human being. And the question is, what kind of institutional orders would you need in order to create that kind of a possibility of empathy, which would prevent the kinds of dark scenarios that we have been looking at? Because then, and that's my question to you, the Hirschmanian question would be, he really had a belief in the end, in the infinite possibilities and the creativeness of human beings. And what would be the Hirschmanian answer to it in terms of the creativeness and kinds of institutions which would enable something which would take the one scenario and not the other?
Well, I think, and so the accent on the political economy side was a nod to Hirschman here for so to how to think from the economy or about the economy, as I guess Polanyi would say, as an embedded system. And so I focused largely on the social scientists. I left the philosophers and the history of the photographers and so on out of the story. They obviously appeared here occasionally, but the first thing that Albert Hirschman would say is reservation to think that, let's say, Homo sapiens, not to say Homo economicus, is a simple entity. That there are contradictory drives within humans at any given time, which is why things are perpetually unstable. That instability or that disequilibrium is very fertile. What makes humans, so creative and so capable of doing, great things on the one hand, but horrible things on the other. He really resisted any claim about a basic ontology, So a Hirschman response would say, admit complexity of ourselves and complexities of the systems that we create to govern ourselves. He was very interested in, and this is in a way going back to interdependency, in systems of checks and balances, or what Americans would call checks and balances, to prevent the pendulum from swinging too far either way. So if you go towards the euphoria, you need to find ways to check it with realism. If you give in to realism, bring back a little bit more euphoria. So what we should look for is finding mechanisms for, dissent throughout, as a way to check or to control or to rein in the extremes either way. I don't think he thought people were naturally capable of identifying the other, nor did he think that obviously the other was an enemy naturally or competitor in any way. They were both simultaneous. And that's the complexity inside, which is why admitting to interdependency allows us to have an open dialogue about our ambivalence about the stranger.
I think we're going to end on that note, and I'm going to thank you very, very much for this really exciting talk, which leaves a lot of possibilities open and, of course, helped us look back to look ahead. And to those of you who would like to hear more of Professor Jeremy Adelman, you can come to the conference tomorrow, because he's giving, he's there as well. And we have 2 panels starting 9 o'clock in the morning. We go up to 4 in the afternoon. You'll find us in room... We're on the 8th floor.
And there's another public talk.
And that's what I was going to say. I just want to announce another public talk, and that is a lunchtime talk, Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan, day after tomorrow, 31st. And that's our lunchtime talk at 12 noon in the auditorium at 12:30. And it's on China. This time it's about the prospects of democracy in China, looking at the question of is it or how far is it a rule of law, or can we consider it a rule by law, and what kind of a authoritarian regime or semi-democratic regime that some people hope it has could develop or will not. So that's an invitation to the conference tomorrow, and the talk by Professor Cabestan here day after at lunchtime. And thank you very, very much.